All right, hello there. Welcome to Personality Podcasts. I'm your host, Alex Nessel, and right now I'm residing in my home in Plymouth, Michigan. The reason why I'm here is because I came back for the NFL draft, and it was really cool to see Aiden Hutchinson go number two to the Detroit Lions. He grew up a half mile away from here in Plymouth, Michigan. So that's pretty cool, and that's where I'm going to be doing the podcast. But I bring it up because today we're going to be talking about a specific player in sports. We're going to be talking about Pistol Pete Maravich, and we're going to talk about his personality. So having said that, let's get to it. There's three layers of personality. The first one being traits. And something that's really important to remember, not just about traits, but personality as a whole, is it's not stagnant. It's something that is changing throughout your life. You can see it as more of a continuation. There are certain traits that are going to stay very similar across your life. Some may change a lot. There will be core pieces of you that will generally remain the same, but overall, who you are when you're 10 is going to be a lot different than when you're 40 or even 20 to 30. You can see some big changes in your personality. And I think this is really evident in Pete Maravich. So when I discuss some of these traits, it's just important to remember that they were not necessarily consistent throughout his personality. In fact, he was someone who you did see a lot change. So we're going to start with extroversion. And he was high the majority of his life. He was definitely known as a trash talker on the court, but even outside the court, he was just a very vibrant person who would like to speak. Um, Now we move to neuroticism. Neuroticism is one of those things that, did change a bit throughout his lifespan. I would say earlier in his life, he was described as someone who, when he did not succeed in what he was doing, he was very tempered, and stressed fairly easily. This goes on to change much later in his life, but I really want to get into that when I talk about the life story. And that really applies to conscientiousness as well, because earlier in his life, I would describe it as quite low. He was more of an act before you think person, but we'll see that change later on. Agreeableness and openness, however, were pretty consistent throughout his life. He was high on both of these. He was just known to be a very loyal and likable person. Uh, those around him really just seemed to like him. And then as far as openness, he was described as very adventurous. And even just in his play style, you can see, his desire to do new things. I'll also get into that later. So now we can get into the second layer of personality, which is motivations and values. We're going to start with our motivations. All three of these I describe him as very high on. So we'll start with achievement. Pistol Pete Maravich had a strong desire to be the best at whatever he did. And specifically, that was basketball for him because he obviously was an NBA All-Star and uh, Hall of Famer. But he was someone who, even just as a kid, he would be, practicing his head fakes and practicing his long-range shots. He was just someone who was dedicated to being the best. He had that high motor, the burning passion. He is very high in achievement. As far as play, I describe him as very high. He really was someone who tried new things. And, you could see this on the court with how he was a pioneer in the game. He was an innovator. No one played like him, to be honest. It was radical the way his play style was. He got the nickname Pistol Pete Maravich from his shooting form, where he would shoot from the side as opposed to directly vertical with your body, and it looked like whipping out a pistol. So he got the nickname Pistol Pete Maravich. He was an excellent passer for his time, just behind the back and bullet passes, just stuff you see more commonly in the NBA today, but you would never back then. And I know it sounds stupid that I'm talking about, basketball terminology when we're talking about the personality of someone, but I think it is pretty prevalent in how, to just go against the tradition and structure like that and to try new things and to be radical, that really tells you something about your personality if you're willing to do those things. Um, and now recognition, I would describe him as very high on. Uh, it's hard to know whether someone was intrinsically or extrinsically motivated when you didn't know them, but off of what we're getting from the autobiography here, he was intrinsically motivated to be the best, and that's where I think the achievement comes in. But as far as the recognition, his father was a former basketball player, and actually his head coach when he played at LSU, and he was described as someone who was always trying to please his father. And his father didn't necessarily place these expectations on him, but he placed them on himself that he needed to please his father, and he needed to be the best possible person and basketball player for his father. So I would place him pretty high in recognition as well. Now going down to values, loyalty versus betrayal. loyalty all the way. He was described as someone who he would take a bullet for the people in his life. His inner circle is someone who he was really close with. Um, you could even see this the teams he played for, where he adapted his play style to better suit them. He was on some crappy teams, and he didn't complain about it. He just adopted the guys around him and kept playing. Um, so fairness versus cheating, there's not a whole lot to cover here. He was just a fair person who didn't take shortcuts in life. Authority versus subversion, this is the first value I'm going to get to, where I would say is more middle of the spectrum, because he was one of those people that would more um, abide by to what he felt was fair and right, but if he didn't agree with it, he didn't necessarily follow those rules. So he didn't always submit to authority if he didn't agree with it. But more often he did, which is why I would say it's still middle of the spectrum. And now we get to the third layer of personality in the life story. And this is really interesting to me. I described how his life, or I described how his traits really changed from one point in his life to another. That would happen in 1980. But to preface that, as far as what happened before, um, he was more of a tempered person growing up and over his career. I described how he is really agreeable and how he was loyal, but nonetheless, when he did not achieve the things he wanted to, he was very tempered, and he was just described as someone who, would be a mess in those situations. And I think we all know that person who, when they don't get what they want, they are not someone who's fun to deal with. Um, but in 1978, Pete Maravich had an injury that caused him to retire in 1980, and this was at the age of 33 years old. Around this time, it appears he had some sort of existential crisis, because he started experimenting around. He tried Hinduism, he tried meditating, and eventually what worked for him was finding God in Christianity. And he ended up becoming somewhat of a preacher, not technically by job, but it's something he would do in his pastime. He would just go to schools, and he would go to basketball games and actually just preach God, which, based off who he was earlier, it kind of surprised me. And around this time is where he grew a lot more in conscientiousness. His neuroticism, I think, lowered a lot more around this time. Um, and he really was a much different person in his 30s than I think he was previously. But then, unfortunately, before we can analyze how far this would go, he died at the age of 40 of a heart attack. The reasons are primarily unknown. Um, it could have been neuroticism, if you want to say that maybe the stress caused it, but at this time he was a much less stressed person. So I'm not really sure, but that's the life of Pete Maravich. And thank you.